Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion, the multi-billion-dollar burden, managing the costs of COVID-19. My name is Charles Ross, and I'm a principal at Economist Impact, where I lead our technology and innovation practice here in the Asia-Pacific region. It's a real pleasure to be able to spend the next 60 minutes with you discussing this super interesting and important topic, a topic which touches all of us, I think. Before we get into it, many thanks again to MSD for generously supporting this interactive virtual panel discussion. And a big thank you to my four esteemed panelists as well for taking the time to join us today. And I'm going to introduce each of them now. First up, we have Aaron Lim, who is the Group Human Resources Director at Park Hotel Group. And with more than 10 years of human resources management experience in multinational corporations, conglomerates, and startups, Aaron today leads the people strategy for Park Hotel Group. So a big welcome to Aaron. Next up, we have Audrey Chong, who is Vice President, Southeast Asia Operations at FedEx. Audrey's been at FedEx for close to 24 years, and she's been working her way from a manager in operations all the way up to her current role as Vice President of Southeast Asia Operations. So a big welcome to Audrey as well. Matthew Dickinson is Chief Executive Asia Pacific for Hays. Matthew has been with Hays since 2005 and is based in Sydney, Australia. Matthew previously established and led the Hays global enterprise and outsourced business, working closely with strategic clients around the world to help them navigate the changing world of work and optimize their businesses for success. A big welcome to Matthew as well today. And last but not least, Matt Craven, who is a partner at McKinsey & Company. Matt Craven is also a physician and partner with McKinsey & Company's public health practice and the leader of the firm's pandemic preparedness and response work. He has more than 20 years of experience in public health, and he has supported leaders across the public, private, and social sectors in responding to the COVID-19 crisis and preparedness systems for coming out of the pandemic, which is the area where we're really focusing on here today. If you want to read more about each of our panelists, their full biographies are on the console of today's event. So do have a look there if you want to delve a little bit deeper into some of their background and experience. And before I get into the discussion today, just a little bit of background in terms of why we're talking about this right now and why this topic is important. So like everyone over the last 3 years, COVID-19 has really gone from this challenge, which, to be honest, consumed every minute of every day, or it certainly did with my life as well, to now becoming an issue that actually many of us take pride in sort of moving on from. Some people take pride in not really giving it a second thought during our days. But in reality, businesses in particular are still really concerned because of all the uncertainty that this post-pandemic world has for them. The direct costs, which are mostly healthcare related, are pretty well known, and they're related to a lot of those health system costs that we're facing. But as COVID moves into this endemic stage in which we are at the moment, businesses really must come to terms with its effects on those indirect costs, things like the illness, long COVID, caregiving responsibilities, which are causing high levels of absenteeism, for example. And this endemic COVID is forecast to cost economies in Asia billions of dollars in lost productivity, very similar to other parts of the world. In the US, for example, they've estimated something like $1 billion of lost hours in the last year from COVID. So it's quite a critical issue, and it's one where businesses really do need to adapt to this new reality. So today we're going to explore how specifically those indirect costs have affected businesses across Asia Pacific and what actions can be employed to allow companies to cope with these indirect costs. To do this, we'll look at those various strategies which are being employed, what's working, what may not be working in terms of future-proofing businesses for this endemic phase of the pandemic. And from our panelists today, we've got a really good, interesting cross-section of industries and markets across Asia to give us that viewpoint as well. So I'm going to get into the discussion. I might just start with you, Matt, if I might. So I mentioned indirect costs and this massive burden and challenge that we are going to face with that. What do we really mean by indirect costs? How would you class those? What are we talking about there, Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Charles, and great to be here with you today and with the other panelists. I think you teed things up really nicely. The direct costs of COVID are relatively obvious. That's direct burden on health systems, the cost of taking care of sick people. Indirect cost is really everything else, all the other economic impacts that COVID-19 has had. During the acute phase of the pandemic, I think many of us experienced businesses being shut down, supply chains disrupted, schools being closed. All of those things have costs on society, either in the short term or the long term. As we've moved out of the pandemic phase into this endemic phase where we're living alongside COVID, but not thinking about it every day, we're still facing a lot of those indirect costs without really thinking about them. There's a few different categories that we think about and that we've included in some prior analysis that we've done. The first and perhaps easiest to understand is around days lost when people are unwell from work. And yes, that's less than it was, 2 years ago, but there's still a significant burden of disease out there. People are taking days away from work. Some people are able to work a bit from home, others that's total productivity loss, but that is still a very significant burden. A second category is from long COVID or chronic disease. It's obviously a minority of people, but for them, it can be quite a significant period when either they're fully out of work or they're working but at reduced productivity. And so that's a second category we think about. A third category, which has been decreasing over time but is not yet zero, is people who feel fine but are complying with public health guidance that says you shouldn't be around others. And again, for some people that has no impact because they can sit at home and do their job with full productivity. But for many others, following that guidance means that there is an economic cost. And then the last category we talk about is caregiving. People who themselves are feeling fine, but they're taking care of sick kids or sick parents, members of the family who need additional support and are out of the workforce temporarily for those reasons. You put all of that together, and it is a significant break on the economy, which we face on an ongoing basis. It's not top of mind anymore, but it is worth thinking about because of the cumulative impact on business.
Thank you. Just to give people out there sort of an idea of the scale of the sort of direct costs compared to indirect costs. So they sort of like for like, although the list of indirect costs is much longer. What are we talking about here?
So it depends when during the pandemic we're considering, but at the current point in time, we think indirect costs are significantly higher, probably an order of magnitude 5, 7, 10 times higher, depending on the country. Obviously, people are still getting sick, and some of them really very sick from COVID. That's concerning. We need to care for those patients, and that needs to be a top priority. But the cost of that, we think, is small relative to the larger number of mild cases and some contribution from long COVID as well, which is keeping people out of the workforce and putting, as I said, this break on the economy.
Okay, clearly something which needs to be thought of if we're talking sort of 10 times the scale of direct cost. Aaron, if I could bring you in here, you've really interesting business, which I'm keen to sort of delve into, and how you've sort of navigated the pandemic in the endemic phase of COVID. But first, just to sort of give an understanding of those indirect costs, the sorts of data that you might use to be able to sort of measure the magnitude of the effects here, if you could share with what you've been doing.
Sure. Thank you for having me today. So I think at that time, it was critical to consider the overall impact to the company on the onset of COVID. So we were very focused to mitigate the adverse effects of the pandemic while safeguarding jobs and ensuring financial stability at that time. So two areas that I would say I'm very proud of that we have done. So we had almost 0 to none retrenchments and layoffs, and also maximize productivity while reducing costs. So if all done well, you'll be able to navigate challenges without resorting to job cuts. And that was the last resort that we had in terms of the concept and ideas. In fact, we seized the opportunity to transform, making us even more efficient and agile by changing and transforming the way we do things. In the long run, we try to embrace some of the consequences, and we consider two areas of return of investment. One is on the ROI for our business. So cost savings through efficiencies. We implemented initiatives such as the HOST program that we implemented. HOST stands for Hotel Operations Specialist Team. So you'll be able to have an individual team member serving you breakfast, making rooms, checking you in and out, one in particular individual cross-deploying across different departments. So we are able to multi-skill, cross-deploy them and able to cover multiple areas, leading to a more versatile workforce. Yeah, and of course the ROI for our team members themselves, focusing on their career aspirations and what they want to do. So we took a lot of time breaking down learning needs, bite-sized program, on-the-go program learning, and how quickly they can apply those learnings to their daily lives very quickly, and also ensure that team members are adaptable in the ever-changing business landscape at the time. As a result, overall, I'm happy to share that how we operate the hotel is a lot more efficient. We're running at least 30% reduction in budgeted headcount as compared to pre-COVID. So now we have established a very sustainable foundation for future growth and success for the group.
Really encouraging to see that you've taken some positive lessons out of the pandemic and actually made you a stronger business going forward. I just want to delve into that a little bit more if I can. Maybe with you, Matthew, if I can bring you into the conversation. You work with a lot of companies across the region, have a good sort of viewpoint of what they've been doing. Keen to hear from you what you're seeing in a similar way to Aaron was talking about some of the modifications they've made to their business as a result of their pandemic to sort of manage some of these indirect costs. What are you sort of seeing out there? Can you share some sort of examples of things which firms have been doing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charles. And a really great example there from Aaron. Actually, it's good to see organizations being able to execute some of the benefits that they put into the business. I think, as we've come out, a lot of organizations are reviewing their cost base and how their costs are structured, and becomes a productivity question, and the cost of managing and running your business on an ongoing basis in light of slightly elevated, or in some instances significantly elevated, absenteeism levels. And so what we've seen organizations do is really kind of step back and think about their organizations from a resilience perspective, and how they become a bit more agile in utilizing their workforce to deliver either, create product or deliver service to clients. And so they've done an assessment. A lot of them have done an assessment across the critical roles that they have within their business, and then looked at training people and workflow distribution between different workers, so that they maintain resilience in terms of being able to deliver service or deliver product to their customers. One of the things that we've actually seen as a benefit that has come out of this is some upskilling of employees, which they've seen as a benefit, but it creates resilience in the model and allows them, with a lower cost base, to deliver ongoing service to their clients. And that's meant they've had to prioritize tasks and projects within their business so that they can focus on those to deliver services to their clients. The other thing as well, we saw a lot of organizations going to remote or hybrid working, obviously through COVID, and it's about maintaining and continually investing in that remote work infrastructure within their businesses, so that they can support those workers that are at home caregiving or at home that are infectious, and so can't come into the office as well. One of the other things is we've seen an increased utilization of non-perm workers to manage workload. So as opposed to having people that are actually working overtime, which is a high cost burden on organizations, increasing the organizations to manage their cost base are also utilizing non-perm or temporary and contract workers to be able to mitigate some of those things. And in addition to that, there's been a kind of ongoing investigation into automation and centralization of non-core tasks. We've also seen slight uptick in recent times looking at offshoring as well, just looking at wage arbitrage opportunities in that area.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I just want to touch on one of your points. You talked about sort of this focus on remote work, and you touched on sort of frontline workers compared to the back office workers. And Audrey, this is an area where your firm has to manage with different types of workers within the organization. So I'm keen to understand from your perspective, your view on indirect costs, what they might mean for you as a business, but specifically what it might look like in terms of the different types of workers you have within your business.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. So first, I'll talk about the different types of workers that we have, namely the front line, and then as well as those that require those office team members. So at FedEx, the safety of our employees is of utmost importance, and that's underpinned by our mantra, which is safety above all. So during the peak of the pandemic, one of our biggest challenges we faced was keeping our frontline employees safe, because they need to keep the commerce flowing, as well as to deliver the vaccines to those people in need. So due to the requirements of being present on site, we had to do a few things. So number one, we had to install the necessary safe distancing measures across all our facilities. And number two, implement rotating schedules so as to minimize contact. And number three, we also develop contingency plans and policies that specifically addresses absenteeism caused by COVID-19. For example, having clear protocols for reporting absences, documenting sick leave policies, establishing backup resources. That's very important because we want to make sure that we manage our work disruptions. Also, we ensure that our team members, they're adequately supplied with face masks, and in some cases, PPEs. Now, while just now I mentioned about keeping our frontline employees safe. Next, I'll go on to talk about, making sure that our team members who are working in the office, they receive similar support. Most of them are working from home, so we ensure that there is continuous employee engagement through numerous virtual activities. We also had more regular check-ins by managers. And last but not least, ensuring that they have the necessary equipment and the setup to work from home.
Thank you, Audrey. You touched on the role of frontline workers and some of those those policies, protocols that you have in place. FedEx, of course, operate right across the region of all the people who are joining us here today. Are you seeing differences in terms of the policies, the protocols you might have in place for people within the different markets, whether it's from Singapore to Australia to Hong Kong and across the region?
Yeah, so actually when we look across the countries, right, we ensure that all our practices are consistent. So we do make sure that, for example, those that I have mentioned, the safe distancing measures, of course, the safe distancing measures, they differ across countries. And if we recall, the authorities do have different, especially the airports, they do have different ways of working, the closed loop systems that we are familiar with. Rotating schedules is also one that we implemented across. So it's about keeping, it's like a bubble operations, keeping all our frontline employees, ensuring that they minimize contact so that we manage any workflow disruption. As I mentioned earlier, we also have the contingency plans and very clear protocols of reporting absences. So I think in short, we all benchmark across the countries and make sure that the best practices are adopted by the different markets. And of course, I think one difference is really that the government regulations differ from country to country. So we also want to make sure that when we implement the practices, they are in compliance with the government regulations.
Okay, good advice for people out there with businesses operating across the region. We need to be consistent as much as possible, but obviously also need to abide by the regulation. Matt, the sort of work that you're doing, is that a consistent approach you're seeing? Are we seeing similar sort of levels of indirect costs or impact of indirect costs in various countries across the region, which sort of warrants this similar approach for all markets, or are there some differences?
Yeah, I think directionally it's more similar than different. The basic factors are the same. The buckets I described a few minutes ago, I think would apply widely, but there are some differences. As you're thinking about the indirect costs of COVID on a country, I think about three things. First, and perhaps simplest, the GDP per capita matters. So richer countries are going to get to bigger numbers. That's probably pretty intuitive. Secondly is the burden of disease. And of course, that varies over time, but a country which is experiencing more infections at a point in time is going to experience more indirect and indirect impact, with that indirect being bigger right now. That in turn is driven by levels of immunity. And so countries that are maintaining high levels of immunity through recent infection, through vaccination, are going to be better positioned. And it varies month to month, but we do certainly see some trends. And then the third category is, related to what Audrey was just talking about, the combination of different policies, but also perhaps cultural norms around whether people work through sickness or are more inclined to take time off. Some of that is government mandated, but the norms of behavior in different countries are perhaps at least as important. In some countries and in some parts of the world, it's been normal for a long time that to minimize COVID, to work through, perhaps not even to mention it. In others, much more socially acceptable to stay away versus to be seen to be around others when you have symptoms. That also can drive significant differences. So the combination of those three things, I think, is going to drive the impact on any given country, and of course that changes over time.
Yeah, I can definitely see that, Matt. I live in Australia at the moment. Before that, I was in mid-pandemic in Singapore, and it's definitely a very different sort of environment around an attitude towards COVID. Matthew, you want to jump in?
I just think one of the things, and I was going to ask Audrey her view on it, is undoubtedly one of the things we're seeing, and mentioning you raised Singapore versus Australia. Singapore feels like they've been a little bit more proactive in asking organizations to be more proactive around keeping disease out of the workforce and having more stay-at-home type protocols and that as well. Whereas in Australia, we've probably seen Australia, New Zealand, a bit in Japan as well, a bit of reporting fatigue and probably operating slightly slower from a response rate to what we've seen in Singapore. And so it'd be interesting to get Audrey's perspective on that in terms of some of the differences that she's been seeing.
Yeah, I think in terms of, when we look at Singapore, right, you're right, Matthew, to say that there is it's more proactive, and the measures actually they are I would say they are very clear about the measures as well. And I think that's also in part due to the public-private partnership. So I think what the Singapore government has done well is to constantly be in touch with the companies, to see what works and what needs to be tweaked. Of course, every country is different. So I think in terms of Australia, I think there are cultural norms as well. So we at FedEx, basically what we do is that we have the basic recommendations, basic SOPs, standard operating procedures, to handle COVID. But as I mentioned earlier, it's also very important to take into consideration the cultural norms, as you mentioned, and number two, what the government regulations are, and we adapt accordingly.
I'd love to get your view on that as well, Aaron. Within the sort of hospitality sector, you were obviously massively impacted through the pandemic, and there were definitely different ways of addressing it during the pandemic. I felt that between sort of staying in hotels in Singapore compared to staying in hotels in Australia, different measures, different ways of dealing that with in terms of that customer interaction. Are you still seeing differences in terms of the way we're now in this endemic world? I know you were talking earlier about some consistency of your employees across the region, but are we seeing differences in terms of the way your businesses are operating?
I would say we have successfully evolved. We're not going back to old way of doing things. Definitely every company and organization is prioritizing safety and health for sure. So what we've learned, and in fact, our hotel spent a lot of time being a government facility for quarantine and stuff. So in terms of the protocols, the cleaning efforts, cleaning environment, and some of our team members are actually certified swabbers if we need them anytime. So with that, I think that we can also see a very obvious increase in workplace agility. So the workplace has undergone significant transformation towards that area. And previously, what we have been resistant in terms of certain work arrangements, like work from home. So now we have fully changed our perspectives. So considering that the challenges that we face, I do think that the hospitality industry has fully embraced this concept of flexibility. And we now offer, I think, very similar to what Audrey has mentioned about remote work for specific roles, staggered working schedules, even for the corporate HQ office that we have, rotating shifts for operations. And I think right now we've come to a conclusion that we actually appreciate more face-to-face time as we go along into the hybrid world. And when we are actually working physically in the office, we actually spend most of our time prioritizing the collaboration work and discussion. To top it off, I think just now Matthew mentioned about the technology and using tools. So I think we will observe an accelerated adoption of technology at the workplace. So at our hotel, we were doing contactless check-in, check-outs, digital menu of F&B, online booking systems, so on and so forth. And that quickly took off during the pandemic because borders are closed and there are social distancing regulations. So if you don't do that and evolve very quickly, you're gonna be left out, right? So once we adopted that and make ourselves more efficient and enhance whatever we have, it's actually pretty I would say a very optimistic thing that we are looking at. Then again, not going forward, but increasingly embracing ourselves with new technology, new practices, and how to do our foundation work even better.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. We've talked a little bit about Australia, a little bit about Singapore. I just want to delve into some of the other markets, which some of the people who are joining us today are joining us from. Specifically, we've got a big group of people joining us from sort of Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea. Potentially some culturally quite different markets, particularly from Australia, where I am based. Maybe Matt, I can go to you, and if you have sort of any insights, any things that you've been seeing out there from any of those markets in terms of differences, approaches to indirect costs, anything you've seen out there, when you've been working with any firms from Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Korea.
Yeah, as I said a few minutes ago, I think those three factors around overall economy, burden of infection, and then the combination of policies and practices are what drive it. I think when we apply it to the markets that you just mentioned, Korea has some of the highest costs that we've seen amongst the countries represented on this call due to relatively high ongoing infection rates. And again, that changes over time. But certainly at periods it's had high ongoing burdens of infection, and then relatively persistent policies that limited workforce participation for people who tested positive, and these things are dynamic. But when we look at kind of the last 18 months, there's perhaps been more there. So Korea has some of the highest costs. Hong Kong probably somewhere in the middle of those three. Again, quite high infection rates for significant periods of time. Obviously, high GDP. And sort of middling perhaps in terms of policies, and then of those three, the numbers would be lower perhaps in Taiwan, given a slightly lower GDP per capita, and leading to lower cost per infection. And then when we look at kind of long-term averages, perhaps slightly fewer cases during the period that we looked at in our analysis.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Matthew, I want to ask you around absenteeism. I know it's something which comes up when you're working with your clients, what you're seeing around the region as well. Big issue, weighs on productivity at all firms. Just wondering, from your perspective, are you seeing any differences in absenteeism across the sort of markets that we're talking about here today, or what sort of strategies might you be seeing companies deploying to combat absenteeism?
Thanks, Charles. I think we haven't necessarily seen a data point. I'm not privy to any data points that shows variation in the absenteeism rates across the different geographies that we're talking to today. But undoubtedly, as I mentioned a bit earlier, organizations continuing to invest in those flexible working models for those that can do. We're seeing that as being beneficial to organizations to maintain resilience in the model. So allowing remote working, hybrid working as well. We're also seeing a lot more flexible hours and shifts that flexible shift type operations to support that, and also reduce infection cross groups within the organization as well. The other thing that we've seen is ongoing, and probably to a much higher extent than what we've seen prior to the COVID pandemic coming out, was support for vaccination and promoting vaccination within the workforces, and many employers actually also providing vaccination facilities at work. And that's not just with regards to COVID, but normal flu vaccines and that as well. There's undoubtedly also been an uptick in communication. So organizations are constantly communicating protocols around safety at work, and supporting their colleagues to be able to make informed decisions as well. The other thing that we've seen is a step up that would definitely happen through COVID and has maintained, is supporting employees from a mental health and well-being perspective. There's been increased investment in those employee support programs as well, and then kind of helping people maintain physical safety, physical health support as well within the workforce, which is all trying to manage the absenteeism rates within their businesses on an ongoing basis. But the best organizations are continually assessing what's working and what isn't working, and adapting in an agile way to support their employees.
Aaron, is this sort of ringing true in terms of what you're doing, what you're seeing in terms of absenteeism? Any other strategies you might want to share that you might be sort of working with?
Thanks, Charles. I was about to do a quick raise. So for us, we see it as whether or not we have adequate support for employees to maintain the productivity levels. So we actually provided opportunities for team members to have extended breaks to sabbaticals, and it's a very open conversation. So it can range from 3 months to 6 months, and in some cases even a year to do what they needed during COVID. So this allowed them to recharge, rejuvenate, and come back refreshed while we keep the jobs for them. And this sabbatical arrangement actually gives us a very valuable, it acts as a very valuable tool to demonstrate our commitment to employee well-being, like what Matthew just mentioned about. Otherwise, we also took a look at the internal programs that we have to build a strong pipeline of internal talent. So we have management training programs, executive management leadership programs, and these were all aimed to upskill and increase the competencies of our team members and to provide growth opportunities just within the group itself. Yeah. So of course, attracting external talent, we focus on what I call the 5 love languages. So for HR total rewards, we also have 5 of them: compensation, benefits, flexibility, which is a new one, performance recognition, and of course, career development. So we realized that if you're able to speak to the needs and wants of team members, you'll be able to retain them even better. So it kind of counter some of the impact of absenteeism, and of course, not forgetting flexible work arrangements. So we recognize the need, the very important need for work-life integration to address some of the personal challenges related to the pandemic. And we also allowed team members to apply for time off and whatnot, so that they can manage their responsibilities both at work and personal space. Yeah, so at our corporate office and some of the roles that we have, we offered a 4-day week to help them allocate more time for personal matters. Now, of course, some of them actually appreciate that because they could use that time to spend quality time with their loved ones. So that actually worked for us, pretty much.
Great that you're trialing a 4-day week. I know there's a lot of sort of programs out there or trials out there, sort of testing what it looks like, what sort of impact it might have on productivity. At The Economist, we usually trial a 4-day week in August, and I personally say I'm much more productive during that period of time as well. You have those days off, although we do call it a summer Friday, which is a bit unusual for me being in Australia because it's deep winter. But your comments there actually lead on to a question we've had from our audience. We've got some really great questions from our audience who are joining us here today, and it's really around that measurement question of productivity. So the question is, what criteria does the company use to measure employee productivity, other than things like time at the desk spent? I suspect not too many of your people are and spend a lot of time behind the desk. So how else would you measure sort of productivity within your business?
For us, we are very performance driven. So productivity for us can be the revenue per headcount that we hire. It can be the headcount per room. So and in F&B, it can be a productivity of how many covers or how many customers a team member can serve over a period of time. So we track that very closely, especially during COVID. You know, the borders are closed. There are some regulations on and off. Sometimes 2 packs dine in, sometimes 5, sometimes 10, and it goes back to 2. So we also took that time to embrace the gig economy part-timers that we have, so that we can, in my own term, is like a switch on and switch off as when we need. So that pretty much help us control the productivity, maintain that, and also to monitor whether we are off tangent or not.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. I'm just having a quick look through some of the other questions that we've had from our audience. One of them is an interesting one here, and so the question is, how can businesses use persistent uncertainty to their benefit, whether that's uncertainty internally or externally, rather than a barrier to decision making. So how can we use persistent uncertainty to our benefit? I'm going to open it up to anybody that wants to have a go at that one. But maybe I would point to, say, Matthew or Matt, who might want to have a go at this one as well. How can we thrive during uncertainty during this period of time?
Yeah, I mean, I think, persistent uncertainty designates an ongoing changing environment, which in reality was an environment that we operated in prior to COVID, and organizations that were kind of forward thinking kind of embraced it prior to COVID. What COVID meant, and if you look at a lot of the organizations we work with and ourselves as well, we had to implement some change very, very rapidly through COVID to be able to manage and provide continued services to our clients. And I think it's that mindset, if we maintain that mindset, which is the mindset that's associated with persistent uncertainty, and creates an agile business that you've got to run. And it creates the organizations that have been best at adopting that and embracing that. We're seeing them as responding to now the ongoing changes that we're seeing in the workplace to a much greater extent and much more successfully than those that aren't. And if you step back and kind of remove ourselves just from the COVID discussion for a moment here, and think about, the world we operate in today with, many countries having high inflation rates, higher interest rates, that impact on the working environment and the people that work for us, our employees, and how do we, in an agile environment, adapt to that and deliver services to our clients. The other thing as well is bringing people back into the workplace, which is, an ongoing area of discussion for organizations that we work with in terms of bringing people back in. But there's an uncertainty about that as well, as does that increase the indirect cost associated with the endemic phase of COVID-19 as well? So that's, a debate that many of the organizations that we work with are having today.
Matthew, you're right to call out that the uncertainty we're feeling with COVID is not a new thing that business leaders are having to deal with. Matt, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Matthew just said. Look, I think how do you thrive under uncertainty? The first step is to recognize that all your competitors are facing the same uncertainty as well, right? That you're thinking about how can you do better than the competition and serve customers who are also operating in an environment of tremendous uncertainty. What we're seeing is that, the uncertainties around COVID are less than they were, fortunately. I remember some of the economic scenarios that, were out there early in the pandemic, and, in the good cases, we were getting back to 2019 levels of GDP in, a handful of months from the onset of the pandemic. And in the bad scenarios, it was going to be 6-7 years. And, predictably, we've landed somewhere in between. Yes, there's still COVID uncertainty, but less than there was. The other big trend I think we're seeing is the recognition of infectious disease risk as part of a wider portfolio of risks that companies are managing. And that, if you'd ask chief risk officers in 2019, what are you thinking about? Well, you think about exchange rates, you think about inflation, you may be concerned about supply chains, specific risk to any given business. And now somewhere in that list, probably somewhere mid to upper still is disruption caused by infectious diseases, whether it is ongoing risk from COVID-19 or the threat that something else is going to come along and cause challenges as well.
Yes, Matthew, back to you.
Yeah, just commenting on that, just to kind of support Matt's point. As a global organization ourselves, we conduct regular risk assessments, and if I recall, prior to COVID, the risk assessment matrix that we looked at and how we manage and mitigate those risks and what the risks were, the concept of pandemic was always there, but wasn't something that you took overly seriously. Whereas now it's got a completely different lens. And as a result as well, you look at all of the risks on that risk matrix, and you look at them in a completely different lens to what you historically did prior to COVID, in that those are quite real risks And so I think it's changed the risk environment that organizations operate in and the cognizance of some of those risks to a greater extent as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Matt. Super interesting. I just want to draw on one more question I have here from the audience, and this one could be good for Audrey or Aaron, so please do chime in. So we've moved into this endemic phase, which has changed sort of the way we think about the pandemic. It's also changed government policy towards the pandemic. So in the US, for example, so a move to an endemic phase sort of triggered things around how health insurance is dealt with. So a lot of people may suddenly be without health insurance in the US because of these changes in policy. Just get from a local feel here in the region and any specific country examples you might have. Are you, Aaron or Audrey, and this is the question, are you seeing any sort of these short-term intermittent issues that might have come up as a result of moving into this endemic COVID phase? Anything surprising you about what you're sort of dealing with at the moment? Any particular issues, any particular challenges that might have come up on your plate, which you were sort of either unforeseen or the scale of them is larger than you were expecting? Aaron or Audrey, or Matt or Matthew, if you have something to add on that.
I can start first. I think for me, I think one of the things that we have placed greater emphasis on is the mental health for the employees, like one of the speakers has just mentioned. So across the countries, we continue to promote and encourage employees' wellness by organizing virtual talks on mental health of the employees and also providing access to counseling services. So that's something that really stood out for us, that that during the pandemic and endemic, the mental health. Ensuring that our team members, the wellness of the mental health wellness is important.
Excellent. Thank you, Audrey. Aaron, you want to add something?
Yeah, I guess when we operate in different markets and countries, how the government actually implements certain measures, policies is very critical. So I would think as we go into the endemic phase, people that we work with, team members that work for us, they are a lot more confident about the things that may be coming their way. Policies, practices. I can't recall how many memos and how many communication sessions I did during COVID just because of the change in regulations. So I think it's coming more of a norm and it's kind of stabilized. So that being said, I think all team members within the organization in all companies are all more prepared for things like that to happen nowadays. For government, I think we are very fortunate to be in Singapore with all the stimulus packages that we draw from our government reserves that help us a lot. Yeah, but of course, moving forward, that is only a temporary measure, and we hope that our business and the business all across different countries will be able to stay resilient and be more efficient in the business model. I think the other part is on the infrastructure investment from the government. So I think Singapore, for example, we have invested a lot during pandemic for different kind of a social distancing efforts and all that. So that will come into play, like what Matthew and Matt mentioned about the pandemic risk assessment that they were talking about. So if we happen to have another pandemic or not pandemic, similar kind of crisis, I'm quite sure that all governments out there are already more prepared than previously. And of course, what we are hoping and starting to see is the market access, international trade support from the government for both inbound and outbound travel. So that can be very beneficial in the long run. So I think it's a constant checking in of the position of our company and how the government can actually accelerate that growth, or in fact some form of enhancement in terms of how we operate both locally and regionally.
Thank you, Aaron. You mentioned that all governments are better prepared, and yes, they should be after the sort of the crash course training sessions they've had over the last couple of years. I just wonder, Matt, from your perspective, if you think some are better prepared than others, or are there any sort of particular approaches or policies that you've seen out there in the markets which you wanted to call out, which are encouraging, which you think are sort of making us better, more resilient for what's to come?
Yeah, so just to clarify your questions about kind of what are countries doing to be prepared for the where we're going next. Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all been living and experiencing this over the last few years. As much as we would like COVID to go away and not to think about infections, the burden of disease does still matter. And one of the biggest drivers of economic impact is going to be the health impact. And so countries that do better at managing the burden of disease are going to face less economic consequence. And so, countries that are setting themselves up with regular vaccination campaigns that have high levels of trust, where those vaccines are likely to be accepted, populations are going to take them. Countries that have ready access to therapeutics for those who need them, who are thinking ahead about how to continue managing COVID in the context of their other health system needs. Chances are we are going to see some further upswing or waves of disease. We hope they're smaller than the ones that we've experienced so far. But I don't think we can expect just this to stay in the background forevermore and not to talk about COVID. So measures of that kind will be important. There's also a set of things that many countries are doing, I would say, to prepare for the next threat. As a couple of the other speakers have mentioned, that this is now higher, in the private sector agenda. It's also higher in the public sector agenda. From my perspective, I believe it needs to stay there. We do need to prepare so that the next time something like this happens, there's less loss of life and also less economic impact.
Yeah, really worth calling that out, because you can feel, over time things drop down in terms of their priority because as they slowly fade into the distance. But hopefully we have all learned that lesson, that actually it's, it can come back and bite us pretty badly if it's not still up there as a level of priority. We've got a little bit less than 7 minutes left. I'm just going to run through a couple of questions then we've got from our audience before wrapping up with you. One question here from Matthew, and you touched on this earlier when you were speaking. The question is, what are your thoughts on increasing the use of automation and AI in the recruitment industry? Will it help businesses save indirect costs in the short and long term? Is that an area which you're seeing a lot of activity? You mentioned it was before. Maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think some of the automation and that within the recruitment industry was happening long before COVID and continues to provide probably better customer experience. And if you think about the recruitment industry, its customer is multifaceted. There's clients of the recruitment industry, there's candidates through that process as well. And the same for organizations that are running their own internal recruitment functions as well. So undoubtedly, we're seeing automation as supporting organizations in being more efficient through those processes, and also in providing for better customer experience, which ultimately provides for overall a better outcome for those organizations. One of the things that is probably holding some of that back today is a diversity and ensuring that automation and also some of the kind of generative AI that's now coming to the fore ensures that you maintain diversity and it's actually dependable. You can understand why certain decisions have been made within AI and automation principles as well. So I think once we've worked through some of those within the recruitment industry, we'll probably then start to see even better efficiency and better experience from the customers of those services. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, because that's a very important thing to get right. but undoubtedly over time it will get more and more prevalent and also give greater and greater benefit.
Thank you, Matthew. And similar to recruitment, Audrey, I'm keen to know from your perspective, from the logistics perspective, what sort of impact automation might be having with you at the moment, whether you can share any examples around that.
Yeah, I think in terms of recruitment, I think you know, our emphasis on our emphasis on automation has always been there. So it's not just triggered by the by COVID-19. So, for example, you know, we have our data center is actually in Singapore, and we work with DataWorks. It is a centralized platform, and it gains insights from AI, machine learning, and advanced analytical methods. Now, in Singapore, we recently invested in robotics technology. We have this robotic arm that's able to sort documents up to 1,000 documents an hour. So that's what we have done in Singapore. You know, our investment in robotics technology. But even given that, right, it doesn't mean that we don't need the employees. You know, we upskill them and make sure that, you know, they are suitable for other types of jobs.
Excellent, fantastic, Audrey. We're just about over time. Maybe just open up to the panelists to see if we've missed anything, any final comments, any final thoughts about what you're having, what you're seeing, what you're dealing with out there. No, looks like we've covered a lot of things. It's been a super interesting conversation, and I think a lot of what we've talked about is really sort of setting us up well for success for the future. So putting those things in place to allow us to keep the potential of a pandemic at the top of our priorities, even though business leaders are under challenge with a lot of their priorities, whether it's around dealing with climate change, whether it's dealing with, you know, an increased pressure on the economic situation with higher interest rates, etc. It still needs to stay up there, and I think we're seeing positive signs that it is going to stay up there. What was super interesting for me, learning from this session as well, is the benefits and the way industry has got better coming through the pandemic, particularly around this change in idea around roles within an organization are no longer so much more role orientated, more task orientated. So people are able to be much more agile within their organization and move from role to role because they've benefited from the skilling and the reskilling sort of initiatives and programs which firms have been putting in place, which is good for the employee, but also really great for building that extra resilience within the business itself. So some really positive signs around that emphasis on remote working and seeing how it is, you know, to a large extent here to stay, which again is good for mitigating some of those risks around the pandemic or the endemic phase and the spread of disease, but also really good for flexibility of employees and the resilience again of businesses. So really positive signs I think we've discussed here today from across the region, and good that a lot of things are being put in place to help mitigate some of the risks and challenges that we might face in the future. So I've enjoyed it. I hope everyone else out there as well has enjoyed it. A really big thank you to each of my panelists for sharing their thoughts, their time and their experience. So a big thank you to Aaron Lim, the Group Human Resources Director from Park Hotel Group, to Audrey Chung, from the Vice President, Southeast Asia Operations of FedEx, to Matthew Dickinson, Chief Executive, Asia Pacific of Hays, and Matt Craven, a partner at McKinsey & Company. Thank you to each of you for taking the time to join us here today. A really big thank you to MSD for making this possible. It's a really topical issue. I hope we will continue to have this discussion as we move forward as well, to keep it at the top of business leaders' list of priorities and challenges that they need to deal with. So We have come to the end of our time. Again, a big thank you to everybody, and thank you everybody out there for giving us a little bit of your time to hear from us today. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.